Chapter 16. Christopher stared over the larboard rail as the Leviathan ploughed through the Strait of Gibraltar and toward the open waters of the Mediterranean. He fixed his eyes on the distant town of Tarifa in Christian Spain, stubbornly hoping that help would yet come.
"Stop fretting about it."
Christopher turned to see his grandfather standing in his Turkish slippers and turban, gripping the gunwale.
"You still believe they are coming?"
Of course. Christopher was no longer as certain. He looked up at the green Algerian flag snapping in the wind. The captain assumes he's in friendly waters now.
"Crumb is an arse, and you need to shave."
Christopher lifted his fingers to the patchy new beard that had sprouted on his face. He squinted his eyes towards the west. Maybe they're following until we are through the straits. And what if Lord Sandwich is already planning an attack? That would mean our ships may be ahead. Rescue had been all Christopher had held on to for these terrible weeks. That and his sightings of Raven. But standing on the Leviathan, under a turban, and eating meats a la turquesca, had him disoriented. If not rescue, what? Christopher tried to swallow, ignoring his grumbling grandfather. Christopher then faced starboard and scanned the distant horizon, searching for hope. Instead, the ragged edges of Morocco's mountains mocked him. He took a deep breath. He could only imagine Barbary according to the terrible tales he had been told. And so his mind flew him to chaotic bazaars of wild colours, to the faces of strange people, to camels, deserts, minarets and slavers. His breath quickened, and he hastily returned his eyes to the fading silhouette of Christian Spain. An hour later, Yusuf Reis found Christopher still staring at the horizon. "So, Gibraltar is behind and we are sailing happily in our dear lake," he laughed. "Come, we've some business with the Horbasi, their grandfather and Carew." Curious and hopeful, Christopher shuffled behind the ship's captain to amidships where the Janissary colonel was waiting with a grinning Sergeant Zeki and a score of the ship's crew. Redmond, Clive and Carew were standing awkwardly by the main mast. Yusuf whistled, and a hatch from the lower deck creaked open. A few hands reached into the shadows of the companionway and pulled a cowering slip of a woman into the bright of day. "Raven!" Christopher pressed past his grandfather to watch her emerge on deck, filthy and terrified. His throat suddenly filled. He waved his arms for her to find him. "Raven!" he cried. His belly churned as she shielded her eyes from the sun with her arms. "Here!" Spotting him, Raven lowered her arm and clutched her hands to her heart. Yusuf waved her forward, and in a moment, Kipper Clive stood within 2 paces of his dear Raven. He fixed his eyes on hers as she lost herself in his. The wind tossed her black hair off her face. He wanted to embrace her. "Oh, Raven! My Raven!"
"Silence!"
Zeki rammed him in the belly with his baton. With Christopher folded in two and gasping, the captain turned to Sir Edmund. "Their grandson is taken with this girl, who I think should fetch about 300 Spanish, even though she is too thin. She's a pretty prize, and when she's had a rosewater bath and fattened, the buyer will have a good time poking her about in the booths." "Enough, Crumb!" shouted Christopher. The outburst cost him another baton in the belly. He fell to the boards. "Dost thou see, Sir Clive? Thy grandson is in love." "Here's a fool." "Methinks he'd be very happy if thou had a way to rescue her." Christopher recovered his breath as a light spray of seawater drizzled over the rail. "Colonel Cassim and I agree that if they, the great Sir Edmund Clive, would sign a pledge to ransom the whole of the Irish lot, we'll guarantee their safety in the Bagnio until the agents deliver their gold to us." Christopher answered, "Of course he shall pledge."
"Why should I?"
Redmond's veined eyes glared. Christopher gawked. "Because you can."
"Firstly, they belong to thy father, not to me."
"They do not belong to anyone. You are not selling them. You are ransoming them." Astonished, Christopher turned to Yusuf. "How much?"
"The price is 15,000 Spanish dollars.
"Grandfather!" Christopher squared himself, scowling. "By the love of Christ, they are God's children! You must believe that! He steadied himself as the levitine lifted. The old man scoffed. They are Irish. Redmond's nostrils flared. Forget them. You do not see what these heathens are doing here. They are testing me. Us. He pointed vaguely to the west. Captain Crumb knows that a ship of the line is trailing us through the streets. This offer is intended to earn favor for him when he is captured. In the meanwhile, he wants to humiliate our family by making us beg for the Irish. Yusuf interrupted. So, young Mr. Clive, it seems the baronet has said nay. Now, let me ask you this. If thou was the baronet— Christopher raised his chin and glared defiantly at his grandfather. I would sign the pledge on my knees. Redmond cursed, but Yusuf smiled. So thou hast finally abandoned rescue. Do you see? Barked Redmond. Do you see how they toy with us? And you jumped into their little game like a brainless toady. Christopher grit his teeth. Nay, Crumb, I have not abandoned rescue, but I would sign the pledge and then pin it to thy lips when the Royal Navy hangs thee. He turned to his grandfather. And by the saints, sir, what harm would it be to sign such a thing? Christ, boy, I shall never bow to this heathen. Bow, look at you in that turban. Yusuf laughed. Now, young sir, as I said,
If thou was the baronet.
But I am not. Colonel Qasim took command.
According to our spies, thy grandfather's lawyers have already made you the heir. So if I gave thee a pistol, you could make thyself the baronet with one shot to his head.
Christopher stared at the stone-faced officer, and then at his grumbling grandfather. Qasim nodded to Sergeant Zeki, who pulled a pistol from his sash, cocked it, and handed it to Christopher. Suddenly confused, Christopher caught Taras, wide eyes watching from a few paces away. He answered the officer in Turkish. To be clear, Colonel Qasim, you give me permission to kill my grandfather and thus make it possible to ransom the Irish by my own hand. He spread his feet to steady himself on the deck. Qasim nodded dispassionately. Christopher's mind now whirled. What is this game? But sir, the Sultan would forfeit a great fortune. My grandfather would fetch a high ransom. Qasim's hard face darkened beneath his lowering black eyebrows. What ransom? We both know he is worth 5,000 Spanish, maybe more. Killing him would be a great loss. Qasim put his huge hand on Christopher's shoulder and squeezed. Do you remember the name Ibrahim Bakan Effendi? He asked in English. Christopher turned white. Nodding, he looked nervously at his suddenly surprised grandfather. And do you remember what he said? He stiffened. I? Qasim brushed his black moustache with a sudden air of supremacy. Bakan said, throughout the Levant, the name Clive is forever accursed. He bent low. Hear me well, young Mr. Clive. The Sultan shall not be ransoming the baronet. Quite the contrary. He wishes Sir Redmond to die a memorable death, one that cheating infidels shall talk about in the taverns for all time. Speechless, Christopher looked at the expressionless face of his grandfather. So you see, said Qasim, I am offering thee one chance to rescue the girl you love, and the whole dirty bunch of the other Irish. Otherwise, I think you already know what shall happen. Christopher stared at his raven. Her head was bowed. Her eyes were fixed on her bare feet. He wanted to vomit. Qasim tossed his head and an aging Moor stepped forward. And there is this, he said. Meet Zuhar. He hails from the oasis in the Mazab Desert. Some say he was born on a rock. That is why his head is flat on one side. Others say he was kicked by a camel. Christopher stared blankly at Zahar. The pirate was a toothless Berber with a tangled beard and braided grey hair that hung long beneath a yellow turban. Smiling, Zahar crossed his arms. Kasim continued.
This man has offered to buy Raven and the mother from the Sultan for 700 Spanish. He says the young one for his bed and the hairy one for his garden, unless you choose to save them.
Raven started to weep, and Christopher reached a hand toward her. Yusuf Ray slapped his arm away and put a knife into his chin. There's a way to save 'em all, Mr. Clive, but until thou do, there'll be no touching the Sultan's property. Christopher studied at the cocked pistol in his hand and glared at Yusuf. I'd like to put a lead ball between your eyes. Kasim might be bluffing about Zahar, but Raven in the slave market? No. A picture of the Irish children aboard them flashed in his mind's eye, and he groaned aloud. He had heard the stories of the horrors that they would likely face, horrors that the others from the Hawthorne had already experienced. Can I save them all? Christopher turned his back on everyone and took 4 long strides to the rail where he faced the sea. He breathed deeply of salt air and watched the blue water roll gently beneath him. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, but he barely noticed. Eyes fixed on the sea, he hefted the pistol in his hand. The monstrous temptation felt powerfully heavy. Or I could kill Yusuf. Maybe Kasim. Christopher's breathing quickened. But to what end? He strained to find an English flag among the dozens of ships dotting the straits, like tiny puffed pillows. The Navy must have sent help. The poor youth's mind wrestled against his heart. If I shoot grandfather and rescue comes, then I would have murdered him for naught. If I decline and no rescue comes, Raven shall suffer such terrible—
Mr. Clive,
Kasim summoned Christopher off the rail.
What say thee?
Grimacing, Christopher returned slowly to the circle. He gawked at his grandfather, who was mumbling something incoherent about the Irish and the heathens. All you have to do is agree to the bloody ransom, Christopher roared at him. Redmond blinked a few times.
Never! I shall never cower to these barbarians. I swear this by God and King, and if you—
Stop talking, sir, said Christopher. You are a fool! Do you not hear him? He is not going to ransom you. You shall die for cheating the Sultan. Redmond stared. If I kill thee, then I can save them all. Christopher was frantic.
You wouldn't dare!
Exasperated, Christopher stared at his grandfather incredulously. Why not? You were going to die anyway. He then surprised himself by abruptly pointing the pistol at his grandfather's forehead. And I suspect you shall die a very cool death. Why can't you just sign the damn pledge? I beg thee, sir. Push thy pride aside for once in thy life and find some Christian charity. Redmond said nothing for a long moment. Christopher pressed the barrel hard against his grandfather's skull. He watched Redmond's eyes widen and then slant toward the Janissaries now gathering close.
Nay, they shall not kill me. I am worth a great deal of money. It would be a foolish thing to do. Now lower thy pistol.
Nearly burst, Christopher bent Redmond's head back with the barrel. What? You are nothing to the Sultan. Do you not understand this? Now sweating, Redmond answered. The Sultan cannot afford to order my death. Shut thy stupid mouth. Christopher grit his teeth. His hand began to shake. What is it? You say they are barbarians, and yet you expect them to think like you think. They shall roast thee alive, or splay thee, or sever thy head, or—
Enough!
Redmond hissed.
Hear me, boy. You shall not be pulling that trigger, and I shall not be signing a pledge with these Irish. That is the end of it.
Why must you force my hand this way? Mad with anguish, Christopher swung his head to Raven. His mind filled again with stories of rapine and violation. He returned his face to his haughty grandfather, now puffing his chest like a banty rooster. He took a breath and rose on his toes. He clenched his jaw and squeezed his hand around the pistol. He felt his grandfather's eyes condemning him. His trigger finger tensed. Then Raven suddenly cried out, Know who you are, Kipper? Then do what you must do. Christopher whipped his head toward the soft-eyed girl. What? He lost himself for a moment. What? Know who I am? Who am I? He was no longer certain. He rolled Raven's words over and over in his mind. Struggling, he returned his face to his grandfather and then suddenly remembered something Raven had once said in the cove. Man of hope. She called me a man of hope. His jaw pulsed. He trembled. It was enough. Christopher lowered his hand slowly. He stared at the pistol and returned it to Colonel Kasim, grip forward. I decline, sir. He looked at Raven. Fool, said Redmond. Claybrain fool! You could have taken Crumb hostage. Now we are still in this pickle. Christopher turned his back on the baronet as the old man groused after him. You think I should be grateful to thee? Blah! I expected so much more. Not answering, Christopher abandoned his grandfather and watched his beloved Raven dragged back to the hold. You did well, Kipper Clive, said Raven over her shoulder. Christopher thought her voice sounded suddenly weak. He tried to call after her, but he could not speak.